Hello, my project was on improving the accessibility of Valorant for hearing impaired players. What is Valorant? Valorant is a first-person shooter game that relies heavily on sound cues for gameplay and teammate communication. As a result, the heavy reliance on sound creates a barrier for hearing impaired players, which impacts their game experience and communication with teammates. The target users of this project are hearing impaired players of all gaming experience levels with Valorant. The goal is to help players enjoy the game casually or competitively without the need for auditory cues. Overall, the project is revolved around two problem spaces. How might we help players access game information through visual feedback, and how might we help players communicate with teammates? I first conducted user interviews with 4 players who had different levels of experiences. All 4 interviewees played 10 rounds of Valorant with no sound to simulate a hearing impaired experience. From these interviews, I learned that player experience depends on the character you pick and the player's aim. Some characters are more strategic than others, which require more sound, but overall, being able to aim determined whether the player fully enjoyed the game. I also learned that players were forced into certain playstyles. They would use the minimap more or stare intensely at their screen for enemy movement. Players also observed their teammates' behaviors more. For example, if a teammate played cautiously, they would also play cautiously. Lastly, all players struggled with the lack of directional audio cue for gunshots, footsteps, and enemy abilities. 2 of the interviewers also wished the game could convert speech to text when their teammates talk. I also looked at other games and how they tackled accessibility and teammate communication. Fortnite uses a circle and icons to indicate different types of sound around the player. Call of Duty highlights the screen in yellow based on the direction an enemy has seen you. Lastly, League of Legends uses a ping system where you can mark enemy wards, which later inspired one of my solutions. The first prototype I'm going to address is creating directional audio cues to help players access game information. These were my initial lo-fis. I thought about adding icons that represented footsteps or gunshots onto the minimap because players from user interviews use the minimap more. I also thought about a light blur to indicate the direction of sound, similar to Call of Duty's orange highlight. I also sketched out a combination of these ideas, and from feedback, I learned that using icons to represent different sounds completely changes the rules of the game. It introduces new information to players, which was another design consideration for my hi-fi prototype. Taking in that feedback, for the first round of my hi-fi prototype, I analyzed Valorant's current design system. The only directional sound cue on the game is when a teammate dies and when you take damage. When you take damage, there's a red highlight in the direction of where you take damage from. For my first solution, I created a similar visual indicator to the red, highlighting where an orange directional cue could be used to represent footsteps, gunshots, and enemy abilities. This makes it consistent with current Valorant screens. For my second solution, I created a visual indicator around the crosshair because players usually look in the middle of their screen to aim. A con to this would be that it may be distracting during fights. For my third solution, I created visual cues that distinguish types of sound on the minimap rather than the actual screen. A con to this is that it would require users to check the minimap more instead of what's in front of them. And my last solution was that visual cues on the map are not distinguished. This is so that not too much information is given to the users, but enough for players to know that there's something there. From feedback, I learned that people in general found Solution 1 and Solution 2, which used color blurs on the screen, as more helpful when indicating the direction of sound. To incorporate that feedback, I created videos to represent how the color blurs would work in the game. So in these videos, the orange hue follows the sound. This is the footstep preview. So as you can see, the enemy walks from the left side, and as the enemy approaches you, the orange hue shows up to the very top. And once the enemy is in front of the player, there is no indicator, so that there's no color that distracts the user from when they're staring at the enemy. And the same is for the enemy gunshot. in this video, you can hear the gunshot is coming from the left. So there is an orange hue on the left side. And then once the user turns around, there is no indicator. And in this first solution, the visual indicator does not distinguish between the sound. I also created a solution where there's a visual indicator that distinguishes between the sound. And in this video, the orange is for the footsteps and the blue is for the enemy ability. So there's a brief second in the video where there's a blue and orange hue at the same time, and this is to indicate that the enemy is walking and using their ability at the same time. And then once the enemy stops walking, it's blue only to highlight the enemy ability. From class feedback, I learned that I should consider whether the color becomes brighter when the enemy is closer. I also received a suggestion to use slight hue changes to subcategorize sound. For example, orange indicates walking, but walking on water versus walking on grass would be different hues of orange. Aside from class feedback, I also conducted user testing. I learned that 3 out of the 4 participants preferred solution 1, where the sounds were not distinguished because they believed that distinguishing between sound is too game-changing. However, another interesting point was that more skilled and competitive players may actually not use these visual cues at all because it is distracting. Higher skilled players already know how to distinguish between the sound without needing visual cues, so it may actually hinder their performance. Instead, these visual indicators may be used more by beginners to learn about sound. For my final prototype, I incorporated a mix of feedback. I distinguished footstep noises with different variations of orange. So right here, when the player is walking on the metal, I used a brighter orange. And the moment the player jumps on the land, I used a darker orange. And I also made sure to make the colors appear brighter as the enemy got closer. I also made sure to make the color changes not too obvious so that players would have to notice a slight color change. This is the video in full. Moving on, another aspect of my hi-fi was working on improving communication with other players. Currently, enemy abilities do not show up on the minimap for players and their teammates to see. As you can see on the map, there is only one circle that indicates your ability and there is nothing to indicate the enemy's ability. I designed a new ping to communicate enemy abilities. The current ping system has signals to be cautious, pinpoint a location, ask for help, and to wait. In the new ping system, I added an eye where teammates can indicate that they see an enemy ability. This was also inspired from League of Legends ping system. How the ping system works is that you or your teammates would see an enemy skill, which is the wall highlighted in red. And using the ping system, the teammate would select the eye and ping the enemy ability to indicate that there's an enemy skill. The enemy ability appears on the map for the team. Another thing to note is that this would only work for strategic and defensive abilities such as traps, walls, or smokes. Abilities that end within a few seconds, such as a bomb, would not show up on the map. The new ping would help the team communicate quickly because players wouldn't have to verbally communicate an enemy skill or take the time to type it out. From class feedback, one consideration that was brought up was thinking about why there currently isn't a ping for enemy skills. I learned from user testing that the reason behind this is because marking enemy skills would change the competitive gameplay. It would make it easier for players because they wouldn't have to remember where enemy skills were placed. As a result, one player from user testing suggested that the enemy skill should appear on the map for a max of 3 seconds, just as a form of communication rather than a marker. Lastly, all 4 of the players approved of this new ping and noted that they would use it. These were my final prototypes, which was a video to represent directional audio and a new ping to communicate with teammates. Thank you.